Welcome everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to another Project Blue at Summer live chat. This week we're excited to have Dr. Roberta Marinelli from Oregon State University join us. If this is your first time tuning into one of these, welcome and we're glad you could join us. Now, if you joined us for any previous live chats, you might notice a different layout. We now have a Q&A function to ask questions. So be sure to use that instead of the chat box to ask any questions you might have for Dr. Marinelli. If you want to watch previous live chats or register for future ones, please go to altac-project-blue.org/live-chats. I'll put this link in the chat for your convenience. And without further ado, I'm excited to announce Dr. Roberta Marinelli. She is the Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. As Dean, she leads one of the strongest Earth Sciences programs in the nation, with nationally recognized teaching and research expertise in oceanography, atmospheric sciences, geology, geography, and coastal studies. Dr. Marinelli has been a close friend to the AltaSea project since its inception, and she served on the AltaSea Board of Trustees for several years and remains an AltaSea ambassador. AltaSea and Oregon State established a formal partnership in late spring last year, so late spring this year, my bad. So we're excited to have her here. Today, she will be talking about the future of ocean science. Where are the frontiers? Like I said, if you have any questions for Dr. Marinelli during the chat, please send through the Q&A function located at the bottom of the window screen in the Zoom menu, and we will ask her during the Q&A session towards the end of the hour. Dr. Marinelli, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here and to always have a connection to AltaSea, which I think is just a great organization, and I love what they're trying to do. On my opening slide here, I have one piece of the future of oceanography depicted, and that is what will be the newest research vessel in the nation's oceanographic research fleet, which Oregon State is actually building. This is a vessel that will specialize in studying our coastlines. And Oregon State is building one that will be housed at our own institutional facilities, one which will be housed on the East Coast in a partnership with the University of Rhode Island and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the University of New Hampshire and some others, and then one that will go to the Gulf Coast, a partnership between Louisiana and Mississippi. So the photo on the left, or the schematic on the left, is what she'll look like when she's done, and the actual photograph on the right is a webcam take that shows you what a ship looks like when it's in utero, when it's being formed. And that's happening in Louisiana right now. So we're super excited about this, and stay tuned for updates. And if you really want to see live action, you can just go to the cam and take a look. Even ships get built during pandemics. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about the field of oceanography. It's not something that you see a lot about in junior high school or high school, because it's really considered, or it has in the past been considered, more of an advanced study. And certainly for people who live on the coast, the ocean is very prominent. But for many people who don't, many people who live in the heartland who don't really get a chance to interact with the ocean on a day-to-day basis, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Sometimes the only time we think about the ocean is when it's doing something for us, like if we're getting food from the ocean or if we're recreating on the ocean. And I know AltaSea is right on the port of Los Angeles and close by to the port of Long Beach. And if you have that vista, you know that the ocean is an incredibly important piece of global commerce, because much commerce is exchanged by nations through sea transport, with vessels taking advantage of ocean currents. But what I hope to convince you of today is that there's a lot that we can learn from the ocean about the world, and that the ocean is important for everybody, regardless of where you live. Not just for the things that we use it for, but for the fact that because it's really the largest ecosystem on Earth, and it has a lot of water, and water retains heat, And the ocean is not only the heat engine of the planet in terms of how it distributes heat, but it plays a very, very strong role in global climate, and also global elemental cycles like the cycling of nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. And those are the building blocks of life. So things that we all really need to care about. Now, people, oceanographers, explorers have explored the oceans for centuries, and we've discovered a lot. We've discovered unusual ecosystems. We've discovered underwater volcanoes and exotic organisms, and really a lot about this incredibly large biome. And so we have a pretty good body of knowledge, but like with many things, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know, and that the ocean is a lot more complicated than we previously thought. And this is particularly true as a lot of change is happening in our physical world. The climate is changing, and that climate has a very strong interaction with the ocean. And it's not just the physical interaction, it also has a lot of consequences for ocean biology and ocean ecosystems. And understanding what those interactions are and what they mean for us is really a very important question for everybody's future. Now, about 5 years ago, I was asked to participate in a study that was commissioned by the federal government. And the federal government pays for a lot of the science that occurs at universities and in medical centers, US Geological Survey, et cetera, et cetera. And those are taxpayer dollars. And the government wants to spend taxpayer dollars very wisely. And so they asked scientists in oceanography to tell them what are the most important questions to understand for our future to maintain ocean health and functionality, and what tools do we need to address those? And you think, well, what do you mean tools? You have ships, you can go out and measure things. But actually, the tools that we use to do oceanography are much more technologically sophisticated and complicated than what we used to have. And at OSU, as you can see, we're building a ship, but we have a lot of other tools and techniques that we use to study the ocean. Some of those are robotics. We have underwater unmanned submarines. In our laboratories, we have very sophisticated equipment that measures molecules, and those molecules can be the physical and the chemical properties of seawater, or the things that go into organisms themselves and tell us how organisms interact with their environment on a chemical basis. And these all cost lots of money, but they're all really critical to understanding how the ocean works and what it does for us. And so in this study, we were asked, what questions should we be addressing with our science, and what tools do we need? And so we produced a report, and we came up with 8 really, really big questions. And they're so big and they're so complicated that I can't actually talk to you about all 8 of them. So I thought I would pick 2. And because they're 2 that I think would be particularly meaningful for people who think about the ocean, and they connect to our public in ways that the public can relate to. And one relates to food and ecosystems, and the other one relates to coastal hazards and sea level rise. But before I go into those, I want to talk very briefly about a 3rd question that just came in this morning's news. One of our big burning questions was related to what happens not on the seafloor, but actually below the seafloor. And so the seafloor in many parts of the ocean is miles deep, and it consists of very soft sediment that has all of the dead carbon that has fallen through the water, the results of the decomposition of organisms over many, 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 many years. And it sits on the seafloor and it gets buried. And it's this vast reservoir of carbon. And over geologic time, it's very deep and very, very carbon rich. And people have speculated that there's actually more carbon below the surface of the seafloor than there is on the entire above ground part of the planet, and that there might actually be a rich ecosystem that's supported by this carbon that's accumulated, this vast reservoir of microbes that might actually be active in doing things. And in this morning's New York Times, there was an article in which that depicted some research where scientists actually brought organisms that were deep in that subsurface and brought them into a laboratory and found microbes that were millions of years old. And the microbes woke up and started to metabolize. So really cool science that's going on, but if you want to hear more about that, just pick up today's newspaper. So I'm going to talk about two questions. Let's get back on topic here. And the first one is very, very broad, but it's very, very important. And that question was, what will marine food webs look like in the next century? That's a biggie. I mean, how much have food webs changed over the time that we've been thinking about them? We hear anecdotal evidence, oh, there used to be a lot more anchovies or sardines, and we know that they do change, but what will it look like in the future? That's a very important question, particularly since so many societies are reliant on food from the sea. And parts of that question include the following sub-questions that I've listed here on the left. One is, how are humans impacting food web relationships? We take food out of the sea all the time. Are we disrupting ecosystems when we do that, or are we only taking enough so that the ecosystems can sustain themselves? Another important question is, how will changing climate affect where organisms live and how they can live? A third is, what is the role of ocean chemistry, which we know also is changing, in food webs, and what are some of the feedbacks with the two questions above? And if our ecosystems change, is it a permanent change, or are they more resilient and can they bounce back? So what I've shown here on the left is what I call a very simplified food web that lots of people can relate to. It's actually a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about that complication in a slide or two. But in this picture on the left, you can see sunlight coming in, and that sunlight provides the energy for small one-celled organisms called phytoplankton to harvest carbon and nutrients and make life. And they form the food for another group of organisms called zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton. They're like little shrimp-like crustaceans or crabs. They're really great to look at under a microscope because they move around fast and they dart. And they make you dizzy just looking at them. And those zooplankton are fed upon by small fish, which are then fed upon by larger fish. And what we've learned is that these ecosystems can be disrupted relatively easily. And there are a couple of great examples, one of which happens in California, actually, which I suspect many of the viewers are from. So California, and actually the entire West Coast, has quite a lot of kelp forest in the nearshore environment. And the kelp forests are a rich ecosystem that's supported primarily by not just the physical structure of kelp, but all of the biology that goes along with it. So kelp makes carbon, and that carbon exudes material that other organisms live on, and it provides a habitat for fish and rich microbial environments and a lot of other organisms on the sea floor. And it's also a great habitat for larger organisms like sea otters to come in and feed. And sea otters in the past have eaten urchins as a primary food item. But over the last 100 years or so, there have been multiple episodes where humans have completely overfished sea otters because the fur is very valuable. And in later times, sea otters have disappeared in part due to disease. And what we've learned is when you don't have sea otters in the food web, then the urchins reproduce and there's no check on their population, and they consume all the kelp. And then the kelp ecosystem goes away. And so on the right, you see a picture of what a kelp forest looks like with sea otters in the ecosystem, and then what it looks like without. And the point here is that when we remove one piece of the ecosystem, sometimes it really has a disproportionate effect. And that effect is sometimes, or the species that's responsible for that disproportionate effect can be called a keystone species. Its relationship to the environment is perhaps more important than a lot of the other organisms that live in that place. And another example with kind of a similar keystone but a different system altogether occurs somewhat in the West Coast but also in the East Coast with oysters. So oysters live on the seafloor and they filter a lot of particles and a lot of plankton out of the water. And when they filter so much that they actually make the water really, really clear. And with that very clear water, that means that plants like seagrasses have enough light that they can grow. And they create this really rich ecosystem that, again, like kelp, can be nursery grounds for organisms that we consider quite valuable. And in a number of regions in our coastal environments, oysters have been removed, overfished, and then that benefit of water clarity goes away, and that whole sort of oyster seagrass ecosystem begins to collapse. And so this is kind of a warning sign of, these are systems that we can study pretty easily because they're right on our coast. But offshore, it's a little bit harder. So we really have more work to do in terms of understanding what happens in these vast pelagic ecosystems if we're removing certain really important organisms. What is the impact on the rest of the ecosystem? Another question that we thought quite a lot about is, how will changing climate affect organism distributions and their livelihoods? Well, we have a lot of evidence to show that the ocean is getting a lot warmer. And it's warming by, I think, about 1/10 of a degree centigrade a decade. And that warming means that organisms are not quite living in the same thermal environment that they used to live in. Now, some organisms like humans can live in lots of different places because we have the capability to adapt. And some of that might be by virtue of clothing or by virtue of the kinds of homes that we build or having air conditioning, things like that. But not all organisms are as sophisticated. And whether you can tolerate thermal stress depends on, as an organism, if you have those tools, or if you can move. So think about something like a coral. Coral have very narrow thermal tolerances, and they can't move, they're glued. And so if the water gets too hot, they have little algae that live inside them that make food for them called endosymbionts. And when it gets too hot, the endosymbionts just leave and the corals bleach. That's what coral bleaching is. And so then they don't function as well. But if you're not stationary and you're mobile, you might be able to relocate. But if you relocate, so relocating might mean, like, for example, if you're a fish or you're a turtle, you might just move to a different environment, or you might be able to expand the range in which you live. And we saw that a few years ago when some of you remember the blob that was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that made the West Coast very, very warm and made the West Coast water very, very warm. There were turtles from tropical environments that were migrating up the coast, and that would be a range shift. And that might be great if the rest of the ecosystem that that organism depends on is also sort of migrating up with that organism itself. And so when you have range shifts, you might then have different ecosystem relationships form. And they might be successful relationships or they might not be. We simply don't know. Another thing that happens when you have warming water is that water physically, when it's warmer, it holds less gas. And oxygen is something that we know is a gas in the air that we breathe, but in water, it also exists as a gas. And if water warms up, there's less oxygen in it. And you can couple that to the fact that when water is warmer, there's a lot more decomposition of carbon because everything happens a little faster in warmer water. And sometimes that can produce dead zones in coastal environments. And we've seen that reasonably often on the West Coast, and we've seen it quite a bit in the Gulf. And that can affect ecosystems. And then the last one about how changing climate can affect habitat, we have to go to the poles to really think about this. One of the most important habitats in polar regions is sea ice. And if the seawater is too warm, sea ice won't form. And ice-dependent species, as we call them, things like polar bears and penguins and some kinds of krill, won't be able to survive if they don't have sea ice. And this week, the New York Times had an article saying that global warming is driving polar bear toward extinction. And this was the photograph that they have. It's kind of a lonely photograph, but it really drives home that message that there are a lot of simultaneous changes happening, and the outcomes are very much unclear. Okay. Another important question, which is really, really complicated, but I promise I won't get into the depths of the complication, is what is the role of ocean chemistry in food webs, and how is that changing? So a couple of slides ago, I provided the picture on the left and said this was a simplified food web. It's what I call an organismal food web. It's based on single organisms that, for the most part, you can see, or you can see pretty readily in a microscope. But underpinning all of those organisms is a lot of biochemical machinery and cycling of nutrients and elements that make their bodies up. They interface with seawater chemistry, and that seawater also interfaces with our atmosphere. And here's where it gets really interesting, and I'll just give you one example. Over the last 100 years or so, humans have put a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide diffuses into the ocean, and it changes the chemistry of carbon in the ocean in a way that what we call this phytoplankton, zooplankton food chain might get fundamentally altered, because some of the phytoplankton, and some of these are just small organisms that actually, even though they have a lot of carbon that organisms eat, they also have little shells. Think of a foraminifera or a radiolarian. You may have seen these in your past, but they're little single-celled organisms that have shells with them as well. And they're part of the food web as well. And they're really important for some forms of small fish. And with changing ocean carbon chemistry, it becomes harder for those organisms to form shells. So this is one of a number of examples where changing ocean chemistry directly impacts what single-celled organisms and above are available to the rest of the food web. So what I talked about before when we were talking about otters preying on urchins, that would be what's called a top-down food web control, where the organism at the top is controlling what happens all the way down. Here you have what's called a bottom-up event, where what's going on at the base of the food chain, the chemistry that's going into the plankton, might control the rest of the food web. And these are the kinds of questions that scientists are grappling with, because so many other factors in food webs are changing. A final question is, given everything that I've talked about, all these uncertainties, and I don't mean to suggest that we don't know anything and everything is uncertain. We're definitely working away at the pieces, and we have some very good ideas about the direction that some ecosystems can go in. And it's not all bad news. And in some cases, ecosystems migrate to a somewhat different state, and that state is actually okay. We've seen ecosystems change in our lifetimes, and we know from geologic history that ecosystems have varied over geologic time for lots of different reasons, top-down reasons and bottom-up reasons, and that it's not always bad, it's just what is. But when you depend on those ecosystems, or when your ecosystems relate to very strongly to global climate, you have to take these questions much more seriously on scales that are meaningful to humans, like on the 5 to 10 year time frame. And so one thing that we think about, for example, in coastal ecosystems is, can we engage in restoration? And we have seen a number of projects, some moderately successful, where, for example, planting of kelp and removal of urchins can perhaps bring a kelp forest back, or planting oysters can start to not only yield more oysters, but start to bring back that clarity that, that produces the seagrasses that, that prop up the ecosystem. We also know that some ecosystems are fairly resilient. You can perturb them in certain ways and they're pretty stable. But in some cases, ecosystems reach what we call a tipping point. We're not quite sure what creates that tipping point, but where suddenly there's enough of perturbation that they shift into a different state and a different set of ecological relationships, and they're not as resilient, and we're not sure if we can actually go back to the previous state. So I'm going to stop talking about food webs for a bit, and now I'm going to talk about sea level rise, because sea level rise is something that people care deeply about, particularly in the coast. And it's not a very simple question. It's a real kind of burning question as to how much sea level will rise and how much is it going to vary geographically. And to give you an example, or let me explain a little bit about the uncertainty as to why sea level, why we don't know how much it's going to rise, and why geography plays a role in the intensity of sea level rise for not just the US, but really all over the world. So this is a graph that is produced by NOAA on the left, and it shows how much sea level has risen over the last 140 years. And in the past, we've used tide gauges, things that measure the ebb and flow of the tide to figure this out. But increasingly, we're able to use satellites that can measure the height of sea surface within sub-millimeter ranges, very, very accurate. And you can see the satellite data starts at about 1980, 1985. And it shows that it's gone up about 8 inches over the last 140 years. And some of that is related to the fact that the world is getting warmer and seawater is getting warmer. And there's a very, very simple expansion that happens when water gets warmer. And you can do this experiment at home. It's a nice depiction of it on the right. You put water in a measuring cup and look at where it is, and then put it in the microwave for a couple of minutes and then take it out. You should see that that water level is a little bit higher because water expands as it warms. And that expansion is part of what causes sea level to rise, just due to warming alone. But there's a glacial component to it as well, in that in the polar regions, glaciers are melting, and some of the great ice sheets are thinning and also melting. And that is actually adding water to the ocean and adding water to the system. So we have two things going on. We have more water, and the water's thicker, if you will, or it sits higher. And here's the part that is a little bit more complicated, is that the warming is uneven. And so there are some parts of the world where the water sits a little bit higher than others. So bear with me while I go into physics for just a little bit and talk about thermohaline circulation. And I've got a nice little video here that I hope will work. So if you think about the way the sun hits the earth, there's more heat at the equators than there is at the poles. So water at the equator warms up a little bit more. Water at the poles is actually a lot colder and denser. And what happens is that cold and dense water at the poles sinks. And because of conservation of mass, water in the equator begins to move up and replace it. And this kind of circulation happens all over the globe. And it's disrupted because there are continents in the way. And it also is affected by the physical rotation of the earth. But the bottom line here is this thermohaline circulation is like a conveyor belt. And that conveyor belt acts to redistribute heat, but it's really, really slow. It takes one water molecule about 1,000 years to cycle the entire ocean from surface to deep and all the way around. So this is why the ocean matters to everyone, because the thermohaline circulation redistributes heat, so it makes the equator more habitable, or because it's not as warm, and it makes the poles a little bit warmer too, and it moderates the Earth's climate. So that's why everybody has to care about the ocean. But the height of the ocean isn't even all the way around. So just because you add more water through the melting of glaciers, it's not like a bathtub where everything rises the same. It is unevenly distributed, which means the height of the water is different throughout the globe. So now let's talk a little bit about coastal geology. And I think I have to stop this first. Maybe not. Here we go. Okay, so anyone who's taken geology has probably heard about the plates, the great plates that make up the Earth. And these plates move, and there are varying sizes. And where the plates move, they tend to be very tectonically active areas. That's where you see a lot of earthquakes, like, for example, in the Aleutian Islands or near the coast of California. And then there are areas that are really very sort of long and flat and filled with sediment, like in the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic. And in areas that are tectonically active, in some cases, that the Earth is actually being pushed upward. And so the relative height of the Earth and our coastline is higher. And so sea level may be going up, but the fact that the Earth is uplifting means that the differential is not that great. And so you wouldn't see as much sea level rise there because the Earth also is coming up. But there are other areas where the Earth is sinking, like in the Gulf, in Louisiana and Florida. It's very sedimentary, it's heavy, and then there's been a lot of construction which weighs things down even more. And those are areas where if the Earth is sinking and sea level rises, then you have a much greater problem. So we have regional differences in sea level, and understanding this is a complicated problem. It's not just ocean circulation, and it's not just glacial melt, but it's the individual coastal geology that also plays into it. So this is a very complicated Earth system problem. It's a very complicated mathematical problem, but it's also a problem of things that we need to measure that we haven't been able to measure yet. And I'll give just one example of a study that is just about to start at Oregon State University that was funded by the Keck Foundation, which is based in Los Angeles. And it involves understanding the physics of ice melt right next to glaciers. And it turns out that we don't actually understand how glaciers melt and why to the extent that we need to. And it's not just simple ice, but there's a lot of particles, and then there are bubbles inside the glaciers. And as glaciers melt, bubbles eject, and they might actually enhance the turbulence around the glacier in a way that has a positive feedback loop and makes more melting happen. So how do we figure this out? Well, you can't get next to a glacier because it's really dangerous. If you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that there was just some calving that occurred and a big piece of ice fell into the water, and that's really dangerous. You can't be close to that in a boat. So what we've done, or what one of our faculty members has done, is they've built a robotic boat and they've put instruments on it, and they're going to drive the boat remotely up to the glacier, and they're going to launch an instrument that's going to actually measure fine scale turbulence and the properties of that glacier to figure out whether the world's glaciers and ice sheets are actually melting at a much faster rate than we thought. So I just want to stop there because I think I've spoken for about 35 minutes or 36 minutes, and that seems to be pretty good. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Marinelli. That was awesome. So we got a couple, so I guess I'll just dive right in. So you were talking about this all has to do with climate change, and a common counter argument to the climate change debate. Ryan brings this up, is that similar rises and falls seem to have happened before in our history, in the Earth's history. So what are some things that point to this being different than before?
Absolutely. It's a great question that you asked, because we have a group in our college that is focused on what we call paleoclimate, and that's the climate of the past. And there are a number of ways that you can look at past climate. And one of those is to go take sediment samples from the deep sea and look at what has accumulated over time and relate that to climate. So for example, we know that the ocean has had different amounts of ice cover, and the world has been much colder, and we can relate that ice cover to species in the ocean, and in particular the distribution of isotopes in their bodies. And we know, for example, that at colder parts of the Earth's climate, we get this kind of species that's in sediment, and in warmer parts of the Earth, times in the Earth's climate, we get a different species. So we can reconstruct the Earth history that way. Another way that we can do that is we can go to the polar regions where the great ice sheets are, to Greenland or to Antarctica, where as the ice accumulates, it actually traps atmospheric gas. And that atmospheric gas is remnant of the composition of the atmosphere however many years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And then we can use these clues from the deep ocean and from the ice cores to reconstruct what the climate looked like and what the species were. And so there are two things. Number one, and this actually relates to both aspects of the talk, we know ecosystems have changed in relation to climate, no question there. But the question, what sort of raises the alarm bells is it's the rate of change in carbon in the atmosphere is unprecedented in our Earth's history. And we know that by looking through the carbon dioxide record in ice cores, that we haven't really been in a place where that's like where we are now. And so it's worrisome, but at the same time, we don't really know what the outcomes are. So fair question. The issue here is it's the rate of accumulation. It's much, much faster now than it has been in geologic past.
Interesting. That's a great answer. So kind of on that topic, just kind of going off of it. And I just lost my train of thought. No, there it is. So a common theme of all these chats have been, what can we as just regular citizens do that are not technically in the research field, just kind of, but still believe this is a worthy fight? What, especially to combat sea level rises and what you've talked about, what are some things that the normal person can do to help in this fight?
Well, so, that's it. A lot of it depends on, uh, where you live and how you live your life. I used to live in Los Angeles, and not doing things by car was almost unfathomable. It's an economy that requires that you drive quite a bit. And it's interesting with the pandemic how much the pollution in our major cities has gone down and how much less carbon there is in the atmosphere, because people aren't driving. Um, and I don't want to proselytize about lifestyle, but to the extent that you can make choices to make low carbon footprint choices, it can be very helpful. I'm in a situation right now where I can ride my bike to work, and I do. And people are increasingly moving toward electric cars, which tend to be more expensive, but if you can, that's great. If you can put solar panels on your house, that's also a great choice. But even in the foods that you choose, for example, some forms of food like beef, has a very high carbon footprint associated with it. So, eating less beef. Some forms of seafood we know are not sustainable. And so eating seafood that is more sustainable can be helpful. So there are a lot of individual choices that can be made, but there's no doubt that some of the most impactful measures will come at a much higher policy level.
So you brought up the pandemic again. I'm just kind of going off that. So you brought up the pandemic and how it's had kind of a good effect on the lack of, I guess that's a bad way to phrase it, but the lack of pollution in the air. And I've read some articles about how the ocean has been positively affected by it. Is there any promising research in that field that shows that, the lack of pollution from the lack of commutes, etc., that the ocean sea levels are going to benefit from this?
Right. So, one of the big reasons for watching sea level um, is because we don't. It goes right back to the polar regions where we don't really understand how fast the great ice sheets are melting, and there's some geologic evidence to suggest that ice sheets reach a point where suddenly the disappearance accelerates, and there's where at least at one point in the geologic past, one ice sheet called the West Antarctic ice sheet has disappeared, but then it's reappeared, right? So why? um, and what we worry about with carbon in the atmosphere now is, um, we don't know where that runaway point is. And it would be really helpful to know. Some people say it's a decade away, but if we get to that point where one of the great ice sheets begins to melt, then we're talking meter level sea rise. And that's really, really worrisome. So any way that we can pull back from that would be really, really helpful. And I don't think that the pandemic right now is making a huge dent in the overall estimate of where we need to be in terms of what atmospheric carbon might preclude that from happening. But it's certainly going in the right direction. And I think the real worry for the part of scientists is that we're not moving in the right direction, and we keep moving in the wrong direction.
Interesting. So we have a question from Marco, which is a little bit on a different subject. And Marco asks, one of the most challenging tasks by scientists is to make science and current scientific findings more accessible to all, including and more importantly to voters all over the United States and everywhere. How do you go about it? Scientists use, rightly so, scientific jargons which is not understood by a layperson. Should all scientists be actively involved and trained in science communication?
Absolutely. And I would ask, how did I do? Because I mean, right now, what I'm doing is trying to speak to people about, where the science is and what we need to be concerned about. And it is true that scientists have been trained basically to interact with other scientists, to be very specialized. But increasingly, we know that it's very important for us to reach broader audiences. And in our college and in many universities, we really stress what we call broader impacts and communication. And our funding agencies also ask us, as part of our grant proposals, to tell them how we're going to go out and communicate our findings to the public. And I think we all feel like we need to do a better job. One of the things that we're doing at OSU, I mean, there are many things that we do, but we have what we call Science Pub, where we have a panel discussion um, in a restaurant or in a pub where people can come and have a bite to eat. We give a brief presentation and then we do a Q&A. And folks really enjoy that. The problem is that you tend to get people who are already interested in science, and you're not necessarily reaching the layperson, and that is a problem.
Well, you asked how you're doing, and Dawn just wants you to know that you're a great science communicator.
Oh, good. I worked
So
on it. It's not easy for me to not go in the weeds, and I did mention that I had eliminated a couple of slides. There was just, no, that's too complicated. It's
so
where we our comfort zone.
so kind of going into the weeds, we have some scientific, more based questions. So Michael asks, what are your thoughts about these changes impacting the population of oysters on the East Coast?
Well, I haven't actually thought about that in a while, because it's been a bit since I worked on the East Coast. But when I did work on the East Coast, restoration was a huge deal, and one of the big questions was whether you could restore species that weren't native. And this is a West Coast issue as well. Is if can you restore the species that you're used to having, or do you introduce a new species? And if you introduce a new species, is that okay? I think that there are some oyster restoration projects that have been successful, but I think it's going to take a long time.
Okay, so
There's another piece of that, though, and that is the growing aquaculture business, which is very prominent both on the East and the West Coast. And aquaculture is not something that I talk about. Really important is how we move forward and meet the world as ecosystems change, and developing sustainable aquaculture in a way that doesn't compromise the ecosystem is something that we should all be deeply interested in. And I know AltaSea is working on that with some of their own partners in their Port of LA facility. So huge, and thing they really need to think very seriously about.
Okay, some more sciencey questions. So Mary asks, she has two questions. Is there any mining of the deposits in the area described under the ocean waters? And would increased height of oceans increase moisture on lands nearby?
Well, so there's a lot of concern right now about deep sea mining, because there's a sense that it will become economical, in part because we're running out of resources to build the gadgets that we like. We're running out of easy places to get them. And so going to the deep sea might be the next step. And there's an active movement to try and understand what the impacts are, and whether this is something that we can do without harm to deep sea ecosystems. And one of the problems is that we don't actually know that much about deep sea ecosystems, because the ocean is so vast and hard to explore. I mean, it's really dark down there and really cold, and to study it, you often need a submarine, and you can't go down for long periods of time. But there are folks working on trying to preclude harmful mining, and you can the work of Lisa Levin at Scripps Institution of Oceanography is really worth looking at. she's thought about this a lot. I think she has some great pictures of what happens when a deep sea ecosystem is disrupted simply by, a bottomlander making tracks. And those disturbances stay for years and years and years because the deep sea is so quiescent. If you disturb something in a coastal environment, you see when you walk on the beach, it's just a matter of a tidal cycle and your footprint goes away. But that's not true in the deep sea. And so everything that happens there has a really, really long lifespan and long time to go away. As far as the ocean height and will that make land more moist, I think of if you're having warmer water, you're probably having more relative humidity. And that's going to make land feel more moist, especially on the East Coast. But there's a lot of aspects about the coastal hydrological cycle our and our weather patterns that are also changing, and that too plays into the interplay between what's going on water on land and what happens in our coastal areas. Totally different topic, but fascinating.
Okay, so on a similar vein, someone asked, is there any benefit to landforms resulting from the rising ocean waters?
Is there any benefit to landforms doing what?
Resulting from the rise in sea level.
Well, there might be, if sea levels rising, land is likely to disappear because the water will soon overtake it. And if you're in an uplift situation, you're probably in a tectonically active area, and that's a different concern. I think we need to be much more creative about how we build our coastal environments to withstand what we think will be oncoming sea level rise, and perhaps not be quite so adamant about building where we can see and enjoy the ocean, but taking it back a little bit. There are also some areas, some restoration areas that are oriented toward protecting our coastlines in a way that don't do damage. But I do think it's a long-term issue, and it's something that, while it will play out over a long time, we may not have that much time to actually do something about it because sea level is already impacting lots and lots of different areas. And where it gets really critical is when you have storms. So, for example, a storm coming up the East Coast and hitting a place like Florida, or even where I'm from, Rhode Island, when you have a storm, a lot of times the wind blows the water up against the shore, and that's called a storm surge. And so when you have rising sea level and then you have a storm surge, that's when you get the massive flooding that's really, really hard to get out from. And that problem is getting worse.
Okay, so you mentioned tectonic plates, and this is my question.
I'm
Pardon, what'd you say?
I'm not a geology expert, but I'll try.
Okay, well, so something it's kind of on the topic of a lot of people in Los Angeles' mind. We just had an earthquake, and I think the magnitude was 4.2. And the big one, it's been talked about as imminent. It's going to come soon. So, what will the effect on the sea levels be with the big one?
Oh, I don't know because I won't. I'm not enough of an expert to understand how those plates move, but I could find out for you. I suspect that more of the damage would be a little bit inland based on where the San Andreas Fault is. But it's not clear. There's so much about how an earthquake happens and the movement that and the waves that it sends through the earth that um, they can impact different areas differently, which is why sometimes when you see pictures of earthquake, you'll see one area that was devastated and 20 feet away it's fine. And it's just it's how the waves move. Sorry.
No, all good. I didn't feel the earthquake, and I know a lot of my family did. They all woke up from it, and I slept right through it. So, but then the big one, it's always on the minds of everyone.
You-
Pardon?
If you have a fish tank, you'll see it.
Okay, so something that Altasea's been promoting and a part of and is the blue economy. And Teresa asks, as a scientist, do you believe that the blue economy can help with carbon and sustainability, both economically and environmentally?
I do. And as long as the blue economy takes into account ocean sustainability and what it takes to sustain the blue economy, I'll give you a couple of examples. And I kind of laugh at or not laugh, but to me, the blue economy it's so vast and it's so different. It's all of the economic things that the ocean supports. And so if I was to say, use a similar term for land, I call it the brown economy or the green economy. But it's, what we do on Earth is very, very varied, and what we can do in the ocean is also very, very varied, and that can be very positive or not. So, the ocean could support deep sea mining. Is that a good thing for the ocean? Not sure, but the ocean can support sustainable aquaculture. We hope that's a great blue economy effort. And sustainable aquaculture isn't just things like fish and oysters, but it could be seaweeds and algae. We have a great project at OSU that was the topic of one of these chats a couple of weeks ago about wave energy. And we are building wave energy test bed off the coast of Oregon, because Oregon has huge waves all the time. And we're making what we call berths, where people who want to build what are called wave energy conversion devices. So these are devices that take the energy of waves and then convert it to electricity. And our devices will actually be connected to the electrical grid on land. We can actually see if you can generate electricity in the ocean and use it on land. That's a really positive blue energy development that may not be relevant for places like, Kansas, because you would never get energy to travel that far without losing a significant piece of it. And it may not be great for coastal areas where there's just not enough wave energy to support it. So it's very place-based, but it's very important. So I think the key here is sustainability. And there's a lot of ocean, but we just need to be sure that as we use it well.
Okay, so we have one last question because we're running out of time and I know you're busy. So Mike asks, he just graduated with a master's in sustainable design with a focus on developing sustainable solutions to help restore endangered keystone species in their ecosystems. As an example, his thesis was focused on the southern resident orca in the Pacific Northwest and developing habit-forming technology to create positive behavior changes in communities surrounding the Salish Sea. I might have mispronounced that. Are there any sustainable design projects or sustainable focused leaders in the field that you think are making true differences in human relationships with the local ocean habitats? Or are there any resources you would recommend for someone to learn more?
Yeah, I'm on a science advisory board, and I mean, I'm going to give one example, and I'm sure there are many, but the one that comes to mind is a study that is looking at sustainable or the effects of climate change on sustainability in several Nordic countries. And there's a huge focus right now on understanding whale populations and the conversion of their economic value from one that's based on hunting. And so if you think about areas like Iceland or Norway, where whale hunting has been part of a tradition, translating that into a different relationship with humans that's more based on tourism and the appreciation of the ecosystem, and how that's developed, and whether or not you can transition from one relationship of humans with that organism, which is predator based, to another one which is more based on aesthetics and a broader appreciation for the cultural value that that ecosystem brings to the land. So that is an example. And if you're interested, I'm sure that you can be connected to me and I can give you a reference for it. But that's one that comes to mind. But I think it is, there's kind of always a warm and fuzzy aspect of people and marine mammals, but it's really a lot more than that, and something that we need to capitalize on in a way that changes that dynamic and changes the relationship.
Got it. We will. We probably have his email from the registration, so I'll forward it along to you so you guys can get connected. But we're out of time, so I want to just thank you again, Dr. Marinelli, for joining us. It's been an awesome hour, and I hope everyone enjoyed. I just want to announce the next two we have coming up. So please join us again in August, where we will highlight USC Sea Grant beginning on October 14th with Melody Grubbs, who is a science research and policy specialist, discussing similar topic of sea level rise from science to adaptation. And then on August 28th, we will be joined by Dr. Linda Duguay, Director of USC Sea Grants Program and Director of Research for the Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies on Catalina Island. Both of those are at noon, so please join us. The link to register is altasea-project-blue.org/live-chats. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Marinelli. We really appreciate it.
It was fun. Thank you for having me.
And I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Stay safe.